Typiskt. Situngar. Ni ago ni dressy. Nu ni ska dör. Där vart vi överens.
There was a lot of potential for a Magicka sequel, carried not by the game's dated humor and reliance on pop culture references, but by its equally strategic and chaotic gameplay. Just update the graphics, fix the netcode, and put us in more fantastical locations, because the gameplay itself was so solid that not much needed to change. It was just that good. There have been a few games on my radar about arsenal mages, but nothing that really scratched that itch. I don't know, maybe 9 Parchments? And while there were 2 more games with the Magicka name, we wouldn't get a proper sequel for a few more years, so I want to take a moment to acknowledge what came before. The first title was a little game for iOS and PC, Wizards of the Square Tablet. New enemies, stable multiplayer, and an original story that's separate from the first game. A pretty decent title, I'd recommend it if you know where to look. And the other game was Wizard Wars. It was a spin-off that heavily emphasized PvP content, you know, like in esport. Naturally, the more casual players got bullied by the tryhards from the first game. Magicka was already kinda daunting to a casual audience, so fighting anyone with experience in Wizard Wars was like going up against a professional Invoker player on your first game of Dota 2. Anyone would be intimidated. Combine that with a paradox amount of paid content, and you can see why it didn't last too long. But finally, in 2015, it felt like I had gotten my wish. Updated graphics, similar art style, and even the trailer mentioned having better netcode. Magicka was back, baby! Everything felt right in the world. At least until I actually looked at who was developing it. To those who didn't see my video on the first Magicka, Pisces Interactive made a good chunk of the additional content for Magicka, and most notably, 3 DLC campaigns, set in new and interesting settings with a good atmosphere. There are still some glaring problems I'll bring up, but for now, let's begin. The Wizard Wars, the product of overexpansion and the subsequent infighting among the power-hungry and unstable members of the wizarding world. So, all of them. Wizard society began consuming itself, being reduced to history. With the destruction of the magical order, only a few wizards remain, misplaced and isolated from the rest of Midgard. As a result, world peace was achieved. Without the wizards to help the people of Midgard, the lesser races thrived, but the very magics themselves were about to be subject to the whims of fate. Like a grown man at the Golden Corral, a Vanir child will absorb all the stray magical energies cast during the Wizard Wars and become the Avatar, leading to an age of prosperity across all of Midgard. But some would go against prophecy to prevent her full potential, and with the help of our mentor Vlad, exactly 1 to 4 remnants of the Wizard Wars will go out and help keep this child out of harm's way. Right away, compared to the first game, I'm happy to say that I only encountered 1 bug that really bothered me. The subtitles no longer want to fit on my screen, which isn't too bad because this is the only cutscene with captions like this. The game's aesthetic isn't too different from Magicka 1. It's Magicka, but brighter, cleaner, and more colorful. This was something that they only really tried with the Other Side of the Coin DLC, but this was to hammer home that you were in control of an invader, the villain, and if Magicka 1 was off-brand Tolkien, then Magicka 2 has gone full Warcraft. There are no complaints here. Even the elements you use look way better now. The way they materialize and orbit around you is really cool. Life and Arcane are no longer just color swaps, and the nuclear bloom on Frost and Fire are gone now. Not this time, Magma Worm. Life creates plants where you aim, Arcane has an intricate pattern when casted in an AoE, and the lingering trail of lightning is leagues better than in Magicka 1. All the elements look really good, but when it comes to art direction, problems start to creep in. Let's talk about the actual areas. I consider the areas in Magicka 1 to be a little boring, but they had the benefit of being varied. World's End, the Afterlife, how Tristram Village turns into Dracula's castle. You can't knock the game for its scope. Magicka 2, on the other hand, its areas, nor its enemies, are never as ambitious, and despite the updated art style, it's a layer of gloss that covers a real nothing burger. I would have liked the game to go the path of something like Thief 2. Technology was already present in the first game. Maybe technology could advance to show the passage of time after the Wizard Wars. We do get mechanical and technologically enhanced enemies in the latter half of the game, but as it stands, the enemies in the game are somehow less interesting than the ones that came before. Let's look at Khan's Horde from the first game. They are primarily composed of goblins, orcs, and trolls. Minus the human wizards, not much has changed here, but look at this. The goblins had minor variations to show that there was a hierarchy, and these captains usually had better weapons. Even similar to the orcs' white war paint, the goblins in the snow area had modern ice camo. It was goofy, yeah, but it did more to emphasize their militaristic mindset. Different from the Kingdom of Man, the goblins and orcs adapted to their environment. Magicka 2 did away with this. They have some new goblin tinkerers with the flame and frost throwers, but the orcs lost their white paint, which could have been appropriate for the snow. And look, I get it. Who cares? Magicka isn't known for its rich characters and tight world building, right? But for all the things Magicka 1 borrowed from, you can tell that they had fun creating this world. And even if some of these places were blatant references, it was more memorable than this. And speaking of references, some of Magicka's identity was tied to how many things it referenced. So how does Magicka 2 do in this category?
Only had one thing you haven't got.
What's that, sir?
A great big bushy beard!
In the first game, Arrowhead Studios was no more than a few college friends making their first game. As such, they sprinkled in things that they either drew inspiration from, or more commonly, jokes and references to pop culture. Star Wars, King's Quest, Diablo, Castlevania. Although dated, it didn't feel obtrusive. Some even came with an actual effect on gameplay. You weren't incentivized to hold onto your weapons for very long because there were so many to choose from. Additional robes from DLC and even vanilla Magicka had references tied to them, with their own equipment and unique passives that could either help with teamwork or supplement problems that you could have going solo. The references adding to the ever-growing toy box were a fun way of integrating these cultural references into gameplay. Now I'm being very generous here. Magicka's humor wasn't exactly highbrow. At most it was amusing that some of the gags rely on you killing someone for their stuff, but when you include things like Jon Snow, the Dragonborn, and goblins twerking for no other reason than, wow, look at how absurd this is. You're doing the very thing that Magicka 1 narrowly avoided. You've made a game with a sense of humor as a Friedberg and Seltzer movie, and you did away with the guns, like come on. Most of the equipment is lacking that comedic kick from the first game, like having King Arthur's sword with the stone, or the healing hands, which are functionally just fists. It's like all the charm was sucked out. It's kinda lame now. With how good the sound design was for Magicka 1, there didn't really need to be much of an overhaul when going to the second game. The soundscape is nice and busy, the enemies still explode into chunky salsa, and the sound reflects that well, so instead I'll focus on the music. There is dynamic music like in the first game, a bass track and a more hectic version, but now they aren't tied to being in and out of battle. It's more just the game decides to transition to the latter when you get to a certain point in the level. Maybe it's a consequence of the music being less dynamic now, but all the tracks tend to fade in the background for me. Ironically, the biggest standout would be the remixes of certain tracks from the first game. But let's forget all that, because there's nothing more important to Magicka than learning how to spell, so let's move on to the gameplay. To not repeat how the magic system works as I did in my first video, I'll just go over what changed. So right off the bat, you can move while charging and casting elemental combinations. Spells can be assigned to a hotbar, letting you cast on the fly, at the cost of putting that category of spells on cooldown. Familiars return, and can do more than just revive after death, like buffing specific elements, and on the equipment menu, you can customize exactly what gear you want on each specific robe. Even the elements themselves got an overhaul, with wards being the biggest contender, where instead of just negating damage altogether, you can absorb the damage if you cast 4 of a specific element. On paper, most of these sound like upsides, conveniences that can help you become a better zoner, because you're no longer anchored while casting elements, or fumbling around trying to remember spell recipes. So why is this a problem then? Why don't I like playing Magicka 2? Well, the problem wasn't the inclusion of these changes, it's more how they were executed. There was an overhaul for certain elemental interactions. Freezing no longer makes enemies take extra damage, but instead makes them immune to all beams. You can't hit them with anything that doesn't just melt or remove the status entirely. No longer can we use our tried and true Thunder Beam to deal with spongy enemies. In fact, enemies are now resistant or even immune to certain elements, limiting our options further. But here's my biggest complaint. There are too many enemies. Mobs in the first game were slow, squishy, and even when they came in groups, you were either in a big area so you could outmaneuver them, or you were fighting with friendly NPCs. All enemies served to fuel the power fantasy that was Magicka 1. In the sequel, the enemies are stronger, faster, and the maps feel so small. The whole being able to move and cast doesn't amount to much when I'm getting surrounded 90% of the time. The very thing that could solve getting mobbed would be crowd control. Enemies would have to chew through barriers to get to you, if they bother to actually interact with them. Magicka 1 enemies would get distracted by barriers and physically start attacking them. It would make sense that they could just go around them, but now they just don't know what to do if their path is blocked. Even if they're getting attacked by the Bone Brigade, they just don't care. In fact, even if mobs belong to different factions, they don't even fight each other. The one thing you could have done to justify the increase in enemies: set-piece fights of beastmen fighting the Vanir, goblins and orcs clashing with elves and dwarves. I guess everyone hates wizards. Wards though, oh man. Ice and rock armor. They don't knock over light enemies anymore, and melee attacks don't even get deflected. Before, you could handle getting mobbed. Knocking over most of the chaff and casting haste on yourself made repositioning no problem. It feels like I'm playing Dungeons and Demons again, but at least the enemy faction had the courtesy to fight each other. This wouldn't be nearly as bad if the levels were designed more about environmental interactions, instead of just going from one fight pit to the next. Increase the enemies, but give us fun ways to deal with them. Co-op was chaotic and more times overkill for what little resistance the enemy could put up in Magicka 1, but for the DLC, co-op felt required if you didn't want to get washed away by the tidal wave of enemies. But wait, why not use the modifiers that were heavily advertised in the game's marketing? This surely could solve all your problems, right? Not only do you earn these by completing the levels normally, if I'm gonna critique a game on its balance, I also shouldn't have to rely on modifying my experience for a better opinion. The normal difficulty doesn't even use these modifiers. This is the vanilla experience. Do I even need to talk about the spells? Okay, fine. The selection this time is underwhelming, and the cooldowns really make me wonder why they even added them. It was boring to spam the same spells over and over again in the first game, but you still had options if you wanted to combine certain spells. Magicka's original spells didn't have cooldowns, but all of the wide AoE or immediately dangerous spells had the downside of you being caught in the crossfire. Like Crash to Desktop for example. On cast, it targets anyone randomly and removes them from the map. This is pretty good until you realize that anyone includes you. Not only would you die if you were targeted, your loot wouldn't just fall to the ground. It would disappear as well. If you were especially attached to your M60, you'd think twice before casting it with abandon. Most high damaging spells were like this. They didn't need cooldowns because their power went both ways. Now we have fire in a line, frost in a line, frost tornado in a line. Most of these spells are serviceable and the cooldowns are to compensate for the hotbar's ease of access. So why are spells divided like this? All the spells fall into one of 4 categories that are placed onto your hotbar, and if you use them here, they go on a cooldown longer than if you use the spell recipe. But I feel like I'm playing with a muzzle. What if I want 4 movement abilities on the bar? What if I want nothing but AoE spells? And why do spells go on cooldown after I swap them out? There was something really amusing about having a bunch of wacky, overpowered, and more importantly, varied spells that all serve different purposes. It really sold the idea that the wizards of Midgard, while gifted in the art of magic, are ultimately undisciplined and irresponsible. They learn difficult magic as a way to flex, and because why not? In the first Magicka, most enemies were pretty weak and died to almost anything. Some people have a problem with that kind of design, where the opposition isn't challenging enough to justify the myriad of options at the player's disposal. But to put it simply, this isn't the Phantom Pain. Magicka 1 was fun to play because the low time to kill made you feel powerful, and there were little interactions with certain enemies that gave your options more impact. Goblins panicked when on fire. If you disposed of an enemy's shield, they pulled out their sidearm. Certain wizards were hard countered by certain elemental weaknesses, like dousing a lightning mage in water. It felt satisfying to know what countered what during combat, especially when the game got more difficult. Magicka 1 was a bit easy, but not to the game's detriment, because it let you play the way you wanted to. Everything was still viable. Despite the visual upgrade and some genuinely nice quality of life changes,
Are they fighting each other at all?
it's just not as fun to play Magicka 2. I think Magicka 2's campaign is worse than the first game, but I don't want to come off as if I think Magicka 2 is horrible or anything. It just stings seeing what could have been and what we actually got. It's not great, it's not laughably terrible, it's just alright. And those kinds of titles unfortunately fall into obscurity. Ironically, by doing away with most of the references, it became more generic. If it were more out there with its areas or gameplay beyond drowning the player in mobs, it could have been something. Now most people remember Magicka 2 as a dull sequel to a game that's already a niche cult classic. All I remembered was my friend winning a mousepad during a Magicka 2 competition, and they didn't even bother sending it because shipping was too expensive. It goes without saying that anything can be fun if you bring friends.
Are you both yellow? Oh no, what the hell?
So if you get it on sale or from a key reseller, that's the only time I'd recommend getting it. Alright, that's enough for me. I made a list of games that I covered and planned on covering, so if you have any suggestions, shoot them down below. Take care of yourselves, and see you next time.
That's yellow like pee.